Thinking about actually doing the research itself, once we sort of move beyond the sort of the preparatory stage, and it's the thing that springs to mind is the importance of the overall aim and the aims and the need for them to be clear and concise. And sort of the example that I've got here is actually taken from the example EMA and changed slightly. So as an overall aim, how do blog writers make complex academic articles accessible to a general audience? And having this as a sort of an overall aim, but it's still quite broad. And the sort of the idea then that we have 2, possibly 3 supporting questions that drill down into and focus on some of the sort of specific features.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I'd agree with that entirely. I think you need to have an overall aim of where you're going, what you're looking for, but then focusing on the particular lexicogrammatical features you think are going to be revealing and help you assess whether you are on the right track, in assuming that blogs, for example, are more accessible to the reader. So one aim could be something like how complex are the noun groups?
Noun groups, yeah.
And if this is being compared with a more specialist text, which is often the case, how does the noun group complexity and the use of nominalisation compare across the 2 texts?
Yes, and it's like Alex's first aim there didn't sound very linguistic, whereas yours are very linguistic. So you've got to go from the broader aim of, which is kind of how people will interpret the text. And again, that perhaps links to our instinctive feel about it. And then the things that really show your knowledge of this course and how this course can go from a kind of intuition, a kind of feeling about the text, to real knowledge, real findings
and evidence.
Real evidence, absolutely. So in a way, what Diane was talking about there is the kind of thing that you wouldn't have known a year ago.
No.
Yes.
No.
You know, someone who hasn't done this course or hasn't studied this area wouldn't be able to go into that kind of depth that those secondary aims have. I think the aims are important, and I think also the aims should be very closely linked to the title, so that the title can kind of limit what the reader will expect. So you don't want to offer too much in the title. So there shouldn't be anything that the title is promising that won't be addressed in the final project. And also, there shouldn't be anything in the final project that isn't in the title.
In the title, very much so, And it's almost like the way that the title functions as a sort of a summarised macro theme.
Yes.
For the whole project, for the whole text.
Yes.
And it takes it from there. And it's this idea that the overall aim and those sort of lexicogrammatically focused questions that you mentioned, the idea that those are the reference points.
Yes.
Sort of constantly as we go through, we're analysing the text, but we're almost looking behind us to make sure that what we are doing
is going to answer
those questions.
Yes.
And it's this constant sort of, how can I put it, just referring back to it.
Yes, and making sure that you do that means you don't go off on a tangent, which though can be quite rewarding in itself, but it does help to keep you focused.
Yes, And then this sort of leads on to sort of with those 2 or 3 supporting questions, or sort of lexicogrammatically focused questions, as to how much we actually analyse.
Yes.
And sort of how do we cover all 3 register variables?
My advice tends to be you certainly don't need to. If you can cover all 3 register variables, obviously only certain features from within each, in a coherent way, so that they back each other up in the research.
Yeah.
That's great, but it's not necessary.
No.
If you feel that your project is focused mainly on tenor and mode, that's absolutely fine. You don't need to bring in field just because it's there.
No, exactly.
But on the other hand, you might find you've done some research in tenor and mode, and you might think, well, actually, I could just bring in specialist lexis here.
Yes, yeah.
Which is something that you could probably do fairly quickly and easily. It's not something that would take forever.
Yeah.
And you might be able to back up something you're saying about tenor or mode with that.
Yeah. But it has to link in.
It has to link
doesn't
in,
it?
absolutely, yes. It's no use saying I'm going to cover all 3 register variables and just coming up with unrelated features from the variables if they're not going to all act together to support your aims.
And it's very much this. And I was going to say, I very much give the same advice, which is, in a sense, it's better to focus on say 2 or even possibly 1, but going in depth.
I had a student once, and this is going back before E304 and E303 when the guidelines were somewhat different. He studied modality in Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, and he just looked at modality, and he got a pass 1.
Yeah.
It was a very good project, but it was very, very detailed, obviously.
Yeah.
But then, modality is a big area, and you can do that. You can.
Yeah, very much so.
Write a lot more than 3,000 words on modality.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, I mean, I've had students write very good things about the extent to which, for example, stand-up comedy routines were typical of spoken English.
Oh, right. Okay.
And of course, in some ways they sometimes are, in some ways they sometimes aren't. And so comparing different writers, different comedians.
Yeah. And I think the temptation with doing this is to include as much as possible. Is to go for breadth.
Yes.
Because there's, students are told to demonstrate their knowledge of E304, but you can't include everything.
You can't possibly.
No.
And one thing I always say to students is, in terms of their analyses and their findings, they have 800 words to write up their findings. So I think you would find it extremely difficult to cover more than 4 at the most. 200 words per finding.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's pushing it.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And then that leads into. I mean, there's only 1,000 words
for the
interpretation, and it's this sense in which we want to show how much we know, balanced against showing the depth and the detail.
Yes, because I think something that students want to or should want to appear is very systematic.
Yes.
And if you can show that you've done the analysis of an area systematically, that will be very persuasive rather than a bit of this, a bit of that.
A bit of that, yeah. And it's which almost skates over and doesn't demonstrate a depth of knowledge and understanding. And it's very much so. And it's I think one of the expressions that I've seen is talking about sort of the meatier features,
such as modality.
Yes, which gives you a huge amount. And sort of links into appraisal and so on and so forth, and it gives you so much to discuss. In terms of findings, but also in terms of interpretation. And sort of doing it that way, and it's also keeping it grounded in the concepts.
Absolutely,
within the module.
And that again comes down to depth again, because if a student keeps very much on the surface, then we're getting close to impression, aren't we? This is my impression of the material, and this is one of the areas I feel, particularly in the initial TMAs, trying to get some students, not all students by any means, but trying to get some students away from the idea of reading a text and thinking, oh yes, 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 and just writing what is common sense to a certain extent, because a lot of SFL is grounded in common sense. You know, we understand what features indicate interactivity in a text without having to learn about it in terms of saying there are questions, therefore it's interactive. That's common sense. But we want to go deeper, we want to go down to exactly how that interactivity is shown.
And also the other thing that I find students are sometimes concerned about is what happens when the findings don't show huge differences.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting in itself, isn't it? And the students may well have expected to find something different, and they've really learned something. So might the marker. So you know, and the marker will be pleased to have found out something that they didn't expect.
I think sometimes some of the most interesting EMAs I've read have been ones where students have taken what might be a fairly obvious distinction between broadsheet and tabloid newspapers, and they've taken two articles and they've looked at something like maybe features of informality, and they've found the answers they've got are completely the inverse of what they expected. So the broadsheet is actually less formal than the tabloid.
After all, you're only taking one article or one or two articles from those texts. So what might be true of a paper in general might not be true of these particular articles.
Definitely.
Which shows the variation within the different types of newspaper. So that's quite important.
No, absolutely. And this idea that the sort of the data leads to the findings, so that we have the data, say for argument's sake, the number of material processes, and then the findings, you know, the differences or the similarities between the two texts, and then those lead into the interpretations. And those you sort of go back. I think of it as being a thread going back from should be able to trace the interpretation all the way back to the aims and the supporting questions, and your point about the title, and there goes to the title, so it's almost like there's a clear line or link between the title and the interpretation.
There should be a clear flow through the different sections. There shouldn't be. You shouldn't feel as though one section is different from another, in that each section is addressing the same core question.
Yes.
Or questions.
Yeah, very, very much so.